Okay, so Dark Days The Forge is amazing. Oh my god, dude. This story, for real and for true, all right, for real and for true, this is the best thing coming out of DC Rebirth. It's absolutely insane. Like, it's such an amazing story because what it does is bring back a lot of characters who have just kind of been missing in action or that fans have wanted to see return to the main DC landscape. And so before we get into this, one of the things that this does is this actually opens up with Carter Hall. And that's actually a pretty big deal because Carter Hall was the post-Crisis on Infinite Earths version of Hawkman. Now, when it came to the Hawkman character, and I've never really covered him because it is an absolute nightmare trying to cover this guy. With Hawkman back in the day, really before Crisis on Infinite Earths, so everything from the 1940s up to the 1980s, it was an absolute mess. I mean, it was just reboot and reboot and reboot, new origin. It was absolutely crazy, and it was almost impossible to keep track of him. Now, all this was taken care of in Hawkman Volume 4, I think, and I want to say Jeff Johns was the one who did it, although I'm not going to swear to that. But what they basically did is they went through all the Golden Age stuff, all the stuff that happened with Hawkman between 1940 and, the 1980s, mid-1980s, and even after the mid-1980s going up to JSA, and said consolidate all this information, clean it all up, and give a definitive origin for his character. And so what we actually have in this particular story is the origin for Hawkman Carter Hall as we know him. And so what this does is it actually removes the new 52 version of himself and says that's no longer part of the equation. This is the Carter Hall that we know of, that we're most familiar with. And what this does is it basically just kind of, again, runs over the origin that Carter Hall himself was a guy who basically just operated out of Egypt during Ramses, I think it was, and basically came across this ship that was made of Nth Metal. Now we'll talk about Nth Metal here in a second, but after this origin, this quick little 2-page thing is given to us, we immediately jump to the modern day. And that's one of the things that's going to be consistent in this story, is it's going to be a handful of different plot lines coinciding at the same time, but none of it's confusing. Instead, what we're actually going to get when it comes to Hawkman are these little interjections periodically, where we're basically going to see him just kind of chiming in and telling us a little bit more of his story. The issue with this is that we can't really take it in segments, right? Like, we can't jump around the story. Like we did that with Deathstroke, for example. The way that story was written, it was all over the place. And so we split the video in half, and we actually did like one half of the comic and then another half of the comic and took it out of order. We can't do that here. We actually just kind of have to go through everything. But this is pretty straightforward in the sense that there's a guy by the name of Dr. Madison who's working on, in some secret lab based out of a volcano. Things go awry, Batman responds, and Batman tries to get him out. Now, the initial response to this is that Batman, or at least initial indication, is that Batman's trying to save this guy just because of the fact that he's dying. But the question we have to ask is that, how did Batman know about this? How did Batman know this thing was even here? How did he know this guy was stuck in here? Aquaman responds accordingly, and of course we end up having, Batman and Aquaman working together to get Dr. Madison out of there. But what we also find out is this was basically a Black Ops site. No one was supposed to know that it was there. No one was supposed to know that it was that anything was happening here. Of course, we also end up learning they were mining from something, and this is why we ended up covering Scott Snyder's entire run of the new 52 Batman, because all this stuff comes back into the equation. That's why it was so important that we cover all those things, because they all come home to roost. All those chickens come home to roost. And so what this does is it really highlights the idea that Batman's hiding something. Now, again, this is cool because this is Snyder and everybody really going back to the roots of what makes Batman who he is. Historically speaking, Batman's always been this cloak and dagger, enigmatic kind of character, in the sense that after Crisis on Infinite Earths, going into the release of The Dark Knight Returns, that changed the tone of Batman. Prior to The Dark Knight Returns, Batman wasn't like a carefree, happy-go-lucky guy, but he wasn't nearly as dark as he was during that story. In the old original, Batman stories, like the really, really old first appearance of Detective Comics, the first time he got his own solo series, he was pretty dark, but that was par for the course. It wasn't out of the ordinary. Batman killed people. He hung a guy from the Batwing once. Superman killed people, or at least let people die. That was not uncommon. But when the shift began to happen for characters, in the sense that stories were getting a little more upbeat, the characters were being a little less dark, Batman followed that trend. It started moving to the point where he wasn't really dark. Now, we've talked about that before in terms of the basis behind that, the whole idea of the, Comics Code Authority and how Batman almost got canceled. And we've talked about those kinds of things before. But with regards to the character of Bruce Wayne himself, it wasn't until The Dark Knight Returns that he went from, his original appearances being dark, going to more of an upbeat character, and then going back to being dark again. A lot of that was because the Comics Code was being phased out, so it was fine. DC could get away with a lot more stuff in the late 1980s, going into the 1990s than they could back during the 60s and 70s. But with regards regards to the character of Batman, moving towards this darker element, he became a lot more brooding. He became a lot more sinister. In terms of, him hiding things from the Justice League, that was really fleshed out in JLA Tower of Babel. Of course, we covered that story. You'll find that link down in the description. But Tower of Babel basically revealed the idea that Batman had these protocols, more or less, where it was how to defeat the different members of the Justice League should they ever go awry. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't be a problem. The issue was that he never told them. And so what it did is it established the idea that Batman doesn't trust anybody. I mean, he doesn't trust the Justice League or anything like that. We knew that for a while, but it was one of those things that was kind of concrete and set in stone that became an intrinsic part of Batman's history. That's why JLA Tower of Babel is such an important story and such a lauded story by a lot of the comic book community, because it's one of those stories that defines, Batman's character within DC Comics. Now, of course, the response to Aquaman is exactly what we would think it would be. When Aquaman is just kind of like, this is a Wayne Enterprises black site. They're drilling for something. What's going on here? Why didn't you tell me? Why aren't I being made aware of this? Ultimately, Batman just kind of dodges the question, just sort of ignores things. And so what we do is we actually pick up with the Green Lanterns. Now, keep in mind, this really kind of coincides with what's going on in Hal Jordan and the Green Lanterns right now. So remember, with Hal Jordan and the Green Lanterns, when that title first picked up, coming out of the events of Justice League Darkseid War, and even during the whole New 52 run following the events of Flashpoint, what we knew was that, the planet Oa, which was traditionally the home planet of the Guardians of the Universe, had basically been destroyed. Now, this led into a whole litany of events, which we're covering on Sunday, with regards to the entire run of Jeff Johns' Green Lantern going into the New 52, the big reboot and all that kind of good stuff. But it basically left the Green Lanterns having to take up residence on Mogo, who's essentially just a giant Green Lantern planet. That's really all he is. It's really cool, but that's really all he is. But what this is doing is it's basically grabbing all these different plot threads and saying they're all leading to one singular location. In this instance, they're all leading to Batman, because Hal Jordan's actually sent on a mission by the Green Lanterns to go investigate something that's going on at Wayne Manor. Now, of course, this brings Hal Jordan in direct relation to Duke Thomas. And Duke Thomas is one of those weird characters that just really hasn't been fleshed out yet. He was a character that we saw with regards to Scott Snyder's initial Batman run during the events of Endgame, I think it was, and Duke Thomas's parents were subjected to the Joker toxin, and Batman basically had to grab him and whisk him away. But the difference here is that, historically speaking, Batman jumping in and saving some kid's life, if that kid is given special attention, then we know that kid's going to become the next Robin. And that was the case. Duke Thomas received a lot more screen time, so to speak, in the comic than anybody else that Batman had saved. And so we knew that he was going to go on to play a role. Of course, he played a major part in the story We Are Robin, this sort of a teenage vigilante team operating within the realm of Gotham City. But going into DC Rebirth and the launch of All-Star Batman, Duke Thomas was rolled over into the title, and all we knew was that Batman was, quote unquote, trying something different. But we have no idea what that means. We know that Duke Thomas is not Robin. He's not going to be a Robin. It's something different in its entirety. We don't know if he's going to be a replacement. We don't know if he's going to be an equal to Batman. We have no idea what it means for his character. We just know that he's effectively operating alongside Bruce Wayne. Now, of course, the other half of this is that we end up learning that one of the reasons why Hal Jordan has been sent on this mission is because of the fact that there's basically a secret entrance to a cave below the Batcave. Now, again, this is secrets and revelations. These are things that we've never seen before. And it's really cool because this adds this sort of mystery and intrigue to the character of Batman. And it's a really interesting concept when it comes to his character. And the reason why is because it tells us Batman's got secrets. His secrets have secrets. The secrets of his secrets have their own secrets. Like, it's crazy. It's just this constantly falling thing. And that's what made Scott Snyder such a good writer with the beginning of Batman in the New 52, with all those stories we covered, because it was one of those things where it's like, when you think that you know everything, suddenly you learn something new. And that's why this is so cool, is because it tells us there's so much going on with the Batman landscape that's been hidden from us. Now, jumping back to Carter Hall, jumping back to Hawkman, what we end up doing is we pick up with this little bit of a discussion with regards to him and the concept of Nth Metal. And that's why I wanted to hold off on this a little bit. I wanted to wait until we got to this section of the story to talk about this. When it came to the idea of Hawkman, because of the fact that he'd been changed so often over the years, one of the things that Jeff Johns and those guys did is they basically rolled into the notion, the idea of what Hawkman was about in terms of how they could justify his appearances back in the 1940s and in the 1980s. And so what they did is they fed into the existing idea of Hawkman and his reincarnation. Now, that's something that was already established. It wasn't a brand new thing. It was already, built up. What Johns and them did was just clean all that stuff up. And what we ended up learning was that with regards to Carter Hall, of course, him operating as Khufu back during his time in Egypt, he had come across Nth Metal not knowing what it was. But where he was stabbed by an Nth Metal blade alongside Shire Sarah, I think it was, I don't remember if she was stabbed or not. Essentially what happened is that instead of dying, he would just go through this process of reincarnation, and presumably for eternity, he would face off against his arch nemesis alongside Hawkgirl. Now in terms of Carter actually donning the Hawkman mantle, that didn't happen until the 1940s. And the reason why is because of the fact that with him as a character, he was going through and he was just dying and then being reborn and dying and being reborn. That was his life. He would just die and then he would reincarnate in a new body. It was a sort of irony just because of the fact that for him, he never really believed in an afterlife. He always believed that when people die, that's it. There's no moving on to eternal splendor or anything like that. His soul would be confined to the earthly plane for all eternity. And so because of this, we ended up having this scenario where once he was basically reincarnated in the 1940s, he picked up the name of Carter Hall and then adopted the mantle of Hawkman after hearkening back to his memories during the time of ancient Egypt when he had seen this ship that crash landed that had this sort of a hawk crest on it. And so that's really where that whole mantle, that whole name came from. Now, following that, what we ended up learning is that he was effectively obsessed with the idea of Nth Metal, that he just began going through and collecting all these different artifacts everywhere that he could find them. But the problem with this was that he didn't know anything about it. All he knew is that for whatever reason, Nth Metal seemed to irradiate this kind of energy that nobody seemed to be able to figure out. And what this does is it feeds into the nature of Nth Metal in the realm of DC Comics. Nth Metal was one of these materials that DC had where they were just like, well, you know, it's a metal that lets people do whatever they want to do at any particular point in time. It allowed people to fly by negating gravity. It somehow had magical properties, but it was never fleshed out. It was this super ambiguous, enigmatic thing that nobody ever understood or nobody ever really grasped how it is that it functioned. It's like Thor's hammer, right? Like for years and years and years, it was, well, you know, only those who are worthy can wield Thor's hammer. Well, what makes them worthy? Because bad guys have picked it up and good guys have picked it up. The whole idea was that it kind of, you know, was ambiguous. It was weird. There was no real explanation. But where Jason Aaron fleshed out the hammer of Thor, Scott Snyder is fleshing out the nature of Nth Metal with regards to Batman metal, or I guess Dark Knight's metal. So that's why this is such a cool and such an interesting story, because we're getting this explanation on this super ambiguous, obscure aspect of DC Comics that has apparently been intertwined in everything. Now, the other half of this is that, again, we start to see the return of characters that we haven't seen for quite some time, or have simply just kind of been shuffled off to no man's land. A perfect case of this is a guy by the name of Michael Holt, also known as Mr. Terrific. Now, Mr. Terrific was, well, he's been around for a long time, but he was a guy who was basically established as being like the third smartest man in the DC universe. For long-standing DC comic readers, that's a well-known fact. They don't really need a whole lot of explanation about that. So we'll really kind of guide this for a lot of the new folks. Mr. Terrific is one of these guys who's super genius and he doesn't have any powers unto himself. Instead, what he has is like 14 PhDs and like his own tech company, and he's like a self-made man, but he also has this nanotech mask in the shape of a T, or at least as close as you can get to the shape of a T while also guarding his entire face. But he also has these T-spheres, I think is what they're called. And the T-spheres serve a wide array of different purposes, holographic projection and all different kinds of things. But Mr. Terrific is one of the guys that you want in your corner when it comes to being intelligent and accessing different areas. The reason for this is because of the fact that one of the benefits of his mask is hiding himself from electronic surveillance. His ability to basically access different areas without being detected makes him essential in a lot of ways for Black Ops work. And so again, with his intelligence, with his ability to access certain areas, what Batman had been doing is he had actually shuffled him off to Earth 2. Now, the reason why this is important is because of the fact that Mr. Terrific was one of a handful of characters, or minor characters anyway, that received their own solo series during the start of New 52. The issue was that it was extremely poor selling. I mean, it didn't sell hardly anything. Like, I don't even know if it broke 20,000 copies, like 20,000 issues. But because of that, DC basically canceled it and they had its characters sent off by sending him over to Earth 2, basically a line of stories that took place in a different universe in DC Comics, kind of a counterpart to the New 52 main universe. Now, the reason why this is important is because it gave Mr. Terrific kind of a role to play, but Earth 2 is really kind of no man's land, just because of the fact that the New 52 iteration of it, in the beginning it was a good story, but the traditional superheroes that we were used to were nowhere to be seen. And so the revamped versions that we saw during New 52 just weren't really as good as the classic versions that we saw, you know, back before the New 52 happened. And so because of that, a lot of people looked at the idea of Mr. Terrific and said, okay, he's basically been sent off to the cornfields. We'll probably never see or hear from him again once the Earth 2 line of stories get canceled. The other half of this is we actually learned the reason why he went to Universe was because he was effectively a spy for Batman. And the reason why he was a spy for Batman is because Batman's been collecting artifacts. Batman's been doing the exact same thing that Carter Hall was doing in terms of collecting Nth Metal. Now, the big question we have to ask is, Why is Batman collecting it in the first place? Well, what we end up doing is we end up finding out in this little tail bit of a conversation between Bruce Wayne and Mr. Terrific that Bruce Wayne basically makes this statement and saying, it's time to let him out. This person, we don't really know it is who he's talking about until he and Mr. Terrific enter a vault of sorts, and we find out it's Plastic Man. Now, Plastic Man, Patrick O'Neil, was a really interesting character. He basically got like a reboot in Justice League International #1. Well, kind of a reboot, not really. Justice League International #1, he was referenced as being part of the Justice League International team. JLI was designed to be more of like like the Justice League, but more accessible in the sense that they weren't really like cloak and dagger. They weren't like gods. They didn't sit in some, tower out in space somewhere. They could basically be controlled by the government. They wanted to bring Patrick O'Neil in, but they said he was crazy, and that's all we got. We got like a panel. Eventually, they rebooted his origin as part of Forever Evil during Justice League #25, but all it really did is say, here's why this guy is Plastic Man, here's why he's elastic. But this is an instance of DC grabbing fan favorites that have been gone from comic books for quite some time and rolling them in. The reason why this is kind of important though is because Plastic Man in classic DC before the New 52 was like this comedic relief in a lot of different ways. He was the guy that brought a little bit of freshness, some fun, some interest to the comics where, without him, they would have been pretty dark, and pretty drab in a lot of different circumstances. And so it's really just the idea that he's just been kept in stasis, been kept on ice, so to speak, because the weakness of Plastic Man being frozen, for the same reason that if you threw rubber into a fridge, it would probably break. You could take it out once it's frozen and then shatter it or something along those lines. But picking back up with Duke Thomas and Hal Jordan as they're exploring the interior of this cave, this is when we learn everything that's been going on in the sense of what it is that Batman's been doing. And we actually find out that his research into, this Nth Metal goes all the way back to the original Court of Owls story. Remember, when we covered that original event, one of the things that we established was that the Court of Owls were basically creating talons, which is to say these different agents that would carry out their agenda. The Court of Owls was basically this organization that existed behind the scenes in Gotham City that nobody knew about. They'd been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And if somebody stepped into the light that was trying to work against them, or somebody was trying to change the grain of where they wanted things to go, they would send a talon out and the talon would execute them. That was the whole basis behind the Court of Owls rhyme. Beware the Court of Owls that watches all the time, and so on and so forth. It was a really cool way to kind of reinvigorate the Batman landscape. But what they would do is they would basically go through the group Haley's Circus, which is where the Flying Graysons, Dick Grayson's family, came from, or at least where they gained their most prominence. What they ended up doing is Haley, the guy who was leading Haley's Circus, would basically present what he considered to be the most viable candidate for a talon to the Court of Owls. And if they found it acceptable, they would install inside of that person electrum, a material that would just sit inside of a tooth. When that person died, they would be exposed to Dionysium, which would more or less bring them back, and then they would operate as an agent of the Court of Owls as a talon. Now, Bruce Wayne figured out what was going on, and he basically saved Dick Grayson from this almost guaranteed threat. But this tooth resides in the Batcave. And what we find out is that this material, what the Court of Owls has been calling electrum, is actually Nth Metal. Not only that, there's a litany of different things throughout the cave that are composed of Nth Metal. All these different things that are out there are all just Nth Metal materials, and we just never ever knew the entire time. Not only that, Hal Jordan and Duke Thomas stumble upon the Justice League of America team, this Black Ops team that Batman's formed. So this tells us, of course, that it presumably takes place after the inaugural issue of Justice League of America Rebirth #1. So again, they're basically learning all these different things. Now, something to point out is they're basically receiving all this information from some disembodied voice, from some third party that they can't explain. Not only that, every time Hal Jordan tries to use his ring to force this person to reveal themselves, every time he tries to use this ring to find out who this person is that they're speaking to, the ring can't tell him. There's some kind of interference blocking the way. So again, things are very cloak and dagger. They're very mysterious, but damn it if this is not a good story. And so from this point, we jump over to Bruce Wayne and the reborn Superman. One of the most common questions that I saw came on Twitter, and it was people asking, is the Superman in Dark Days, is that the New 52 Superman or the Superman Reborn Superman? This is the Superman Reborn Superman. So this is basically the Superman after the events of Superman Reborn. That's who this is right now that Bruce Wayne's talking to. Now, what we end up finding out is somewhere along the line between the time that the classic Superman stepped into the role after the death of New 52 Superman Batman and this story, Bruce Wayne had asked him for a favor, basically asked him for a hidden vault inside the Fortress of Solitude. We didn't know this happened. This was presumably something that happened off panel. The issue with this is that Batman knew that if this vault exists, there's a key for it as well. And so where Superman created this vault for Batman and then gave him the only key to access it, Batman threw the key into the sun, because for him, he didn't want anybody to be able to access whatever it was that was sitting inside this vault. And so what we end up doing is we actually end up invoking scot-free Mr. Miracle. Now, Mr. Miracle, we haven't seen hide nor hair from this guy. He has vanished. And Mr. Miracle feeds into the whole notion of the new gods, of Darkseid and, New Genesis and Apocalypse and Highfather and all that kind of good stuff. But basically, Scot-Free is the biological son of Highfather, but was raised by Darkseid. Remember, that was the whole aspect of the truce that was struck between the two of them. Highfather and Darkseid were just these two representing factions of good and evil, and they were just destined to fight for all eternity. And so in order to stage a truce, this sort of, I guess, universal chronicler, this guy that traveled around the universe, the multiverse, and chronicled everything he saw, storing it in his Mobius chair, a guy by the name of Metron, brokered a truce and saying that Highfather and Darkseid will swap sons. And so basically Darkseid will raise the son of Highfather, and Highfather will raise the son of Darkseid. And so with Darkseid raising Scot-Free, all he really did is just keep him in a prison cell. That was it. Like, he just kept him locked away the entire time. Now, this allowed Scot-Free to basically become an expert at breaking out of locks, just because of the fact that Apocalypse had some of the best secure locks ever, because when you're a prison planet, you got to make sure that people stay in prison. But the fact remains, this led to Scot-Free adopting the mantle of Mr. Miracle and basically becoming the best person in the universe for accessing locks, for breaking in and out of virtually anything. Now, of course, what ends up happening is with Mr. Miracle being invoked, he of course unlocks this lock at the request of Batman, which is basically revealed to us to be the Tower of the Anti-Monitor from Infinite Crisis. And so I don't even know where to begin with this piece of information. I have no idea how to explain this. I don't know where it came from. I don't know how Batman got it. I don't know if the events of Infinite Crisis are official. I have no earthly clue, but this is huge, because one of the things that we talked about with Infinite Crisis was that with that whole story, Alexander Luthor, which we're not even going to get into that because that goes into a whole nother confusing kettle of beans about the post-crisis landscape. Suffice it to say, the Tower of the Anti-Monitor was basically used to vibrate these frequencies. And what these frequencies would do is it would basically mimic different universes and recreate them, like recreate these different Earths. And so it was by way of the frequencies this tower sent off that you could recreate Earth 2 and Earth 3 and Earth 4 and Earth 5. And so while I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a reboot, what I would go as far as to say is that using this tower, Batman could bring back universes that have long since been gone. Universes that DC got rid of when they launched the New 52. So again, this is a really, really huge piece of information, because what this is doing is yet again, grabbing things from before the New 52, from classic DC, and rolling them into New 52. Again, the whole idea of DC basically blending the New 52 reboot into the classic DC universe and returning a lot of the things that have been gone for quite some time. And so ultimately we end up having Hal Jordan and Duke basically open this giant vault door that they've approached after being told by this disembodied voice. And when Hal Jordan kind of muses to himself about what it is that Batman's gotten himself into, what we find out is that inside this vault is the Joker. Rob Corman. I don't know how he got here. I assume it'll be explained during the events of the War of Jokes and Riddles. I have no idea how he got here. I don't know if he put himself here. I don't know if Batman locked him away in here. I don't know. Like, he's just here. And I have no idea how that happened. Damn it, this is a good story. Oh my God. Dude, I saw this and I was just like, what? My mind was blown. I was totally baffled. I was like, this is crazy, because we have no idea what, I have no idea what's going on. I have no clue. You guys have answers or have questions? I do not have answers. I cannot explain this. Comics cannot explain this to you. I don't know. I have no idea what's going on. But I am excited. I am so hyped up. Oh my God, I'm so excited for this. Anyway, guys, if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you guys later. Peace.